Welcome. So in this video, we're going to talk about the buffer tool and some of the options that you can choose, some of the things to be careful about, and a couple of different ways you can use it. So what I have here, what we're going to work with is this is a watershed outline. And then these purple lines are Forest Service roads within that watershed. And we're going to see how we can use the buffer tool with polygons as well as lines. You can use it with points as well, but we're not going to go over that in this video, but it works the same way. So let's find the buffer tool first. So we can just search for buffer and go to the one that's in the analysis tools. And that should look like this. So the first one we're going to do is show how we can buffer a polygon. And so this is a watershed outline. You could imagine we're writing a watershed plan or coming up with best management practices in the watershed, something like that. And we may want to, we delineated the watershed, but to be safe, maybe we want to add just 5 meters, 20, 30 feet on the edge of all the watershed to make it a little bit bigger, just to make sure that we get the whole thing into our area. So we're going to do that. So we're going to put watersheds as our input feature. So that's the thing we're going to buffer. We'll call this watershed 1, buffer 1. That's fine, but you could change the name. And then this is important here. So you need to give it units. So I'm going to do meters and say I want 5 meters. And what that's going to do is just going to make a buffer 5 meters to the outside of this whole line. If you put -5, then it would go inside of that polygon. And this stuff down here for this function is going to be fine at the default. We'll talk about the dissolve and stuff when we do the lines. So let's just run that. And what we can see, we're going to have to zoom because I probably should have picked a distance that was a little bit bigger, but here we can see this is our original watershed boundary, and then the buffer tool has added 5 meters outside of that watershed. So it's done that around the entire watershed. So now our watershed is just 5 meters bigger on all sides. So that's how we can do it with polygons. Now for this one, I'm going to turn off the watersheds. And so we can just look at the roads. So these are roads, these are polygons. And one thing to note here is that these lines are not all necessarily single lines. There's actually multiple portions to a couple of them. So if we zoom in here, we can see that this is broken up into actually 2 different lines. And so we need to be careful about how that's treated when we add a buffer to our roads. So this will be more clear when we actually look at the output. So what I'm going to do here, so you can imagine, you have roads. You don't want to say you can do certain things within a certain distance of roads, similar to like a stream. You might say, we need a buffer around our stream to make sure that we don't, we install certain best management practices, et cetera. So we're going to give this, the input feature is going to be roads. Okay, so I'm going to change the name here to road buffer dissolve. As we'll see, I'm going to tell it to dissolve. Let's do 50 feet. So it's going to do a 50-foot buffer around that road. Actually, let's do 100 just so we get a little bit bigger. Okay, so first thing is to think about the end type. So basically, when it gets to the end of this road, do we want it to be a flat line or do we want it to be rounded? And so for this one, I'm going to say round. And then the dissolve type, this says what happens when these 2 lines over here meet. Are we going to have a buffer for one line and a buffer for the other, and they're going to stack on top of each other? Or are we going to dissolve them into one feature? So for this one, I'm going to say that I want it to dissolve. So I want to dissolve them here. Okay, and then I'm going to run. So if we zoom in, we can see that despite the fact that this line and this line are separate, it combined the buffer into a single buffer. And because we said n-type round, we see that it's rounded here. So let's do this again, but change, we're going to do, instead of round, we'll do flat. And instead of dissolve, no dissolve. And so I'm going to call this buffer no dissolve. And I'm going to make sure to unselect so that it runs on the whole thing. And then let's click run. So now we'll end up with flat lines for 1, right? So let's turn off the dissolve so we can see, because we did the n-type flat, it just cuts right across instead of having the rounded one like when we did round. And then the other thing is, where we had these 2 segments, now instead of having one continuous buffer, we have a buffer for each of those segments. And so depending on the question that you're asking, right, depending on what type of analysis you're trying to do, you want to think hard about whether it makes sense to have the rounded edges, and does it make sense to split them into multiple buffers or to combine them all into one, because especially with a big data set, those decisions can result in very, very different results if you're like calculating the total area within those buffers. So that's the buffer tool.